Hey everybody. Welcome to the fourth session of this guided reading of Capital, Volume 1. What we kind of figured out last session is that just at the pace that this is going, it's probably going to be, pretty slow read, but sometimes that's good to go into the details of the book. But what I'm going to basically be doing is just going as far as we can each time, and then cutting it off when an hour has gone by or a little bit over an hour has gone by. When there's like a good stopping point after that hour. And so last last session was about the value form, um, and we got into the analysis of the relative form. So I'll pull up the book here real quick. Sorry, the sniffles just from my cat. I'm not Zizek in it, except a little bit with the sniffles, I guess. But right, and so this is this argument that there's whenever commodities stand in a relationship of exchange to each other, one of them takes the position of what's called the relative form, and the other the equivalent form. And when this happens, you have this kind of two things are equated with each other. A is equated with B, or coat is a certain amount of coats is equated with linen. But one of them is what is expressing its value, and the other is the form or the material of that value. And so there's a sense in which when values equated with one another, that A is equal to B is not the same thing as B is equal to A, because in the first case, commodity A is showing its value in the form of a certain amount of B, and in the second, commodity B is showing its value in a certain amount of commodity A. And so the position of the commodity in the exchange matters. Now, notice, again, we're working in a dialectical analysis, so we're building up layers of abstraction. So we're looking at, when we see one commodity expressing itself in terms of another commodity, we're looking at the expression, this value form, from one side, right? And so as we develop more complex structures, we will be able to look at a kind of more multi-sided analysis, especially when we introduce actual people who are engaging in exchange with each other. Now, where we stopped right before this analysis of the equivalent form, which comes after this analysis of the relative form. So let's just continue here. So we have seen that commodity A, the linen, by expressing its value in the use value of commodity B of a different kind, the coat, impresses upon the latter a form of value peculiar to it, namely that of the equivalent. Okay, so commodity A, that has a value. And remember, value is, for Marx, given its objectivity through socially necessary labor time. But this value, which is not a physical part of commodity A, right? The socially necessary labor time that goes into producing this pencil, while you know that that has taken place to make this thing, is not something you can physically see on it, right? You can't see the worker who made this pencil. You can't see the labor that's gone into it or the process that's gone into it. It is objectively true that that process has taken place. But for value, which is what is the congealed labor time, the labor time that's been infused into this pencil, as it were, to actually show itself, we have to place this into a relationship of exchange, and then that value expresses it in the material form of a certain amount of another commodity. And that's the use value of commodity B of a different kind. And remember, use value is connected to material properties. So if you think about a commodity that you can trade with someone, then instead of that thing having a direct use value, it has the value of it has the capacity of being tradable for a different use value. Similarly, if you to jump to a little higher stage, if you have $20, you can think of that $20 is a certain amount of value, or that $20 is a meal, right? You can buy a meal with 20 bucks. Well, in that case, that the equivalent form would be the meal, right? And so it's expressing itself in terms of a use value. The commodity linen brings to view its own existence as a value through the fact that the coat can be equated with the linen, although it has not assumed the form of a value distinct from its own physical form. Let me read this slowly. Now, I may be a little bit slow and tired today because normally I don't teach on Tuesdays, but it's the last week of the semester, and so I have 3 back-to-back classes at the beginning of the semester, so I did just teach today and I'm teaching tomorrow. But okay. So the commodity linen brings to view its own existence as a value. Okay. Through the fact that the coat can be equated with the linen. Okay, so the fact that we can say that this linen is worth a coat, or this amount of linen is worth a coat, this brings to view its own existence as a value. Now this seems interesting, so let's see what's going on in German here. Okay, so existence as a value is just Wertsein, right? It sounds like a Heidegger word or something. So Wert, value, Sein, being. So just value being. Yeah, so although it has not assumed a form of value distinct from its own physical form. It's kind of ambiguous here. I guess it is coat here. Seems like it. The coat is directly exchangeable with the linen. In this way, the linen in fact expresses its own existence as a value. It's Wertsein. The equivalent form of a commodity, accordingly, is the form in which it is directly exchangeable with other commodities. Okay, so now we have a kind of definition of the equivalent form. Let's see if the next paragraph clarifies this even more. If one kind of commodity, such as a coat, serves as the equivalent of another, such as linen, and coats therefore acquire the characteristic property of being in a form in which they can be directly exchanged with linen, this by still no means provides us with the proportion in which the two are exchangeable. So for something to be the equivalent form, it has to be in a form in which it can be directly exchanged with linen. So I guess this would mean like there's like in a barter system there's like there are some bound kind of limits to what can be traded for what just because of their properties or their you know, whether they can be placed into the right proportions to each other. But just because something is in the right proportion doesn't mean we actually know what the proportion in which the two things are exchangeable is. So to be an equivalent form is to basically be constituted in such a way that it can be traded with other things. Since the magnitude of the value of linen is a given quantity, that would be the socially necessary labor time. This proportion depends on the magnitude of the coat's value, right? So the proportion of the magnitude of the value of the linen, so how much the linen's worth, to how much the coat's worth, These are a relationship between the different magnitudes, and these magnitudes are socially necessary labor time embodied in those commodities. Whether the code is expressed as the equivalent and the linen is the relative value, or inversely the linen is expressed as the equivalent and the code is the relative value, the magnitude of the code's value is determined, as ever, by the labor time necessary for its production, independently of its value form. It's interesting that he says independently of its value form. So independently of it being in this relationship of equivalence. But as soon as the code takes up the position of the equivalent in the value expression, the magnitude of its value ceases to be expressed quantitatively. On the contrary, the code now figures in the value equation merely as a definite quantity of some article. So, as an equivalent, the code's no longer a magnitude of labor expressed quantitatively. It's a quantity of whatever coat expressed as the equivalent of the labor in the other thing. For instance, 40 yards of linen are worth what? 2 coats. Because the commodity coat here plays the part of the equivalent, because the use value coat counts as the embodiment of value vis-a-vis the linen, a definite number of coats is sufficient to express a definite quantity of value in the linen. 2 coats can therefore express the magnitude of value of 40 yards of linen, but they can never express the magnitude of their own value. So that's something interesting to think about here, because not to just like dive too heavily into the logic part of capital. Like I don't want to overcomplicate things, but it is fun to look at the logic going on here. There is a kind of way in which commodities are not capable of signifying their own value. There's a kind of this is what Derrida calls auto-affection, right? Where something can like kind of be an I equal to itself without another, or signify itself without going through another signifier. Like there's a sense in which commodities have this structure to them where no code can say how much it's worth in terms of itself, because it needs to measure itself in terms of something else, if that makes sense. And so while 2 coats can measure all types of magnitudes, they can't measure their own magnitude. Those have to be measured in something else. Because they had a superficial conception of this fact, that is, because they considered that in the equation of value, the equivalent always has the form of a simple quantity of some article of a use value, Bailey and many of his predecessors and followers were misled into seeing the expression of value as merely a quantitative relation, whereas in fact the equivalent form of a commodity contains no quantitative determinant of value. Sorry, let me think through this real quick. Okay, so I think this it'd be interesting to go look at the Bailey text and to see what Marx is doing to improve on them here. Bailey and his predecessors. But I think this goes back to this specifically dialectical way of formulating things. And I don't have the same kind of background in the political economists that I do in Hegel. In fact, I have very little background in classical political economy. But if you just think about it as like 40 yards of linen, that's a value. 2 coats, that's a value. And now the values are being compared to each other. that would be where you see 2 coats, 40 linen as different values in a quantitative relationship to each other. But what Marx is saying is that the equivalent form, the thing that's doing the measuring, doesn't have a quantitative determination of value. In terms of this, the value form specifically, when you say like 2 coats can't measure their own value, they can only measure the value of other things. And so when something stands in the equivalent form, when it's the if it's A equals B, the B side, the thing that measures the A, is not being measured. And so it's not a quantitative determinant of value. To say that the 40 yards of linen is worth 2 coats is not a quantitative determination of value of coats. It's a quantitative determination of it's a determination of the value of the 40 yards of linen in the form of use values of coats. I think that's what Mark's saying here. The first peculiarity which strikes us when we reflect on the equivalent form is this: that use value becomes the form of the appearance of its opposite value. Haha, dialectics. All right, right? So, and then Erscheinungsform, that's the term that Marx uses throughout for exchange value. And so we started off with at the very start of Capital, with this dialectical tension between opposites. Commodities are on the one hand use values, and on the other hand, they're exchange values. Now we're seeing the dialectical tension start to resolve itself as things pass over into their opposites. That's what dialectics is all about. It's about seemingly stable oppositions turning into their opposites. And, just like, in Hegel's master-slave dialectic, there's a certain sense in which the slave seems to be, the master seems independent and the slave is dependent on the master. Yet there is another sense in which the master is completely dependent on the slave, and that the slave has the ability to find a kind of inner independence in thought. That's this kind of inversion of opposites that you find in dialectical movements. And so here we have the equivalent form. When something is the equivalent form, the use value of one commodity is the Erscheinungsform, the form of appearance, of its opposite value. So value appears in terms of use value, even though these are opposites. The natural form of the commodity, that's another term for the use value or the material, physical properties of the commodity, becomes its value form. So value being something that is not objective, but is social. I'm sorry, not material, but social. It is objective, but it's not material or physical. But note well, this substitution only occurs in the case of a commodity B, coat or maize or iron, etc., when some other commodity A, linen, etc., enters into a value relation with it, and then only within the limits of this relation. Right? So this only happens when people are trading things with each other. Since a commodity cannot be related to itself as equivalent, so then again, commodities, there's no auto-affection of commodities. They can't relate to themselves except through another, and therefore cannot make its own physical shape into the expression of its own value. Right? So that's another side of this idea that there is no auto-affection to a commodity. It must be related to another commodity as equivalent, and therefore must make the physical shape of another commodity into its own value form. Right? I mean, yeah, anyone who studied dialectics, read Hegel, or at least worked through the master-slave dialectic, this logical move will be very familiar. To say that something cannot simply stand in a relationship of identity to itself except through another, right? You have Sartre thinks about consciousness this way, Lacan with the mirror stage. This is the same basic Hegelian logic of there is no relationship of I to I without I to not I, or without I becoming a we through another I. Let us make this clear with the example of a measure which is applied to commodities as material objects as use values. A sugar loaf, because it is a body, is heavy and therefore possesses weight. So that's the physical properties, right? But we can neither take a look at this weight nor touch it. Oh, yeah. I think so, all right, let me back up again. So a measure that's applied to them as material objects. So he's talking about weight is a way that we measure things insofar as they're physical and material. Now, to say this pen here, or the bread, the sugar loaf, weighs something, right? But you can't see weight. You can't touch weight. You can feel weight in force, the force of resistance, right? Like it pulls on your muscles. But it's not something that is directly observable through the five senses, unless you count like your feeling of your body muscles as being. I mean, it's kind of like a sixth sense in a certain way. That would take us into a kind of territory of phenomenology that maybe we don't need to go into here. But there is no direct empirical or direct kind of in a kind of human sense sensation of weight. That's what he's saying here. We then take various pieces of iron whose weight has been determined beforehand. Right? So you have like little lumps of iron, and each of them has a value, like it's a certain an ounce or whatever, right? The bodily form of the iron, considered for itself, is no more the form of appearance of weight than is the sugar loaf. So, let me double check here real quick the German. Yeah, so for itself, für sich, Hegelian language here, like in relation to itself, as it is explicitly for itself. And it takes a little bit of while of working in dialectics to get used to the idea of something being for itself that's not a human being or an idea or something like that. But you can have like determinations that are kind of implicit to a thing or things that are explicit in the thing. Like for example, one way I like to remember the difference between for itself and in itself is that a number, like the number 5, is positive, but it's positive kind of implicitly or in itself because we don't really designate it as positive. Whereas a negative number like -5 is explicitly negative. And you could think about 5 units either way, on a number line being 5 in a certain sense, and yet if you're not taking negativity into account, they're implicitly positive units, right? So that's like one way I remember using Hegel, the difference between in itself and for itself when it comes to kind of things that aren't ideas or minds or things like that. So the iron on its own, without relation to anything else, for itself, is not the form of appearance of weight, right? It's not intrinsically like, oh, iron, like I can see that it's a weighing thing on it, right? But in order to express the sugar loaf as weight, we put it into a relation of weight with the iron. Aha. So to say that something weighs a certain amount is to put it into relationship to something that serves as a unit of measurement, like pieces of iron, right? And you put it on a scale, you put the little things on it until the scale balances. And so by putting these things into relation, weight, a property of the sugar loaf, takes on the form of appearance of these little iron pieces that you're putting on a scale. If you imagine like how an old scale works, right? In this relation, the iron counts as a body representing nothing but weight. Quantities of iron therefore serve to measure the weight of the sugar and represent, in relation to the sugar loaf, the weight in its pure form, the form of manifestation of weight. Let's see what form of manifestation is in German. That looks like it might be an interesting. It's just Erscheinungsform von Schwere. So just the form of appearance of weight. So there's just the translator used variety there to say manifestation instead of appearance there. They're synonyms. This part is played by the iron only within this relation, i.e. only within the relation into which the sugar or any other body whose weight is to be found enters with the iron. If both objects lacked weight, they could not enter into this relation. Okay, so both things have to have value to enter into a value relation. Just like both the little pieces of iron that are going on the scale to weigh something and the thing being weighed, both have to have weight, right? Hence, the one could not serve to express the weight of the other. I think hence should be like otherwise or something like that here. When we throw both of them onto the scales, we see in reality that considered as weight, they are the same. And that therefore that taken in the appropriate proportions, they have the same weight, right? Just as like the old riddle, like what weighs more, the 100 pounds of feathers or 100 pounds of iron? And they both weigh the same, right? And so everything in the right proportion has the same weight, just like the coats and the linen have the same value, but one stands as the measure and one doesn't. Just as the body of the iron, as the measure of weight, represents weight alone in relation to the sugar loaf, so in our expression of value, the body of the coat represents the value alone, right? So I think this is a very helpful metaphor. However, the analogy ceases. In the expression of the weight of the sugar loaf, the iron represents a natural property common to both bodies, their weight. But in the expression of value of the linen the coat represents a supernatural property. Said it right there, y'all. Their value, which is something purely social. I'm gonna fix my thing real quick so I don't scroll past. All right. Just so I don't read past y'all. So that's interesting, right? So Marx's main concept here is a concept that he identifies as supernatural, right? Which, reading this naively, you would think, well, that doesn't sound very materialist. But ultimately, it's a product of social relations. It's something purely social. Yet it's objective. The value is objectively grounded in the socially necessary labor time. Yet it's not natural in the sense of something you can see on the thing or measure objectively in the case of the weight. Even though you can't see the weight, it is objective. It is a physical property. Because you can ultimately, find this through practice, through the using something to weigh something else, right? That would be an example of a use value, using iron to weigh something. And by using iron in this way, you're manifesting a property of the iron, namely weight. So it's in German it's übernatürliche Eigenschaft. So über, and then the word for nature. The relative value form of a commodity, the linen, for example, expresses its value existence, and that's Wertsein, as something wholly different from its substance and properties. Okay, so this is just to show you what the language is like here. The relative Wertform expresses its Wertsein, right? So there's Wertform, Wertsein, value form, value being. And so there's like a kind of more punchy symmetry here. Expression is again ausdrücken, to press out. Okay, the relative value form of commodity. The relative value form is the side that's being expressed. The Lenin, for example, expresses its value being as something wholly different from its substance and properties. Slightly off there. Als etwas von ihrem Körper. So, as something wholly different from its body. Und Eigenschaften and properties, so that's right. Durchaus unterscheiden ist. So as something completely different. As the quality of being comparable with a coat, for example. So it's value being, value existence. This is expressed not as properties of the thing, but as the properties of being comparable with another thing, with the coat. This expression itself, therefore, indicates that it conceals a social relation. So, we'll get more into that when we look at fetishism. But this would be the comparing itself, the social relation, and then the relationship between the labor actually being done. With the equivalent form, the reverse is true. And this is, already we're seeing this. It's, we're looking at A equals B and B equals A, not as the same thing, but as opposing directions of what Hegel would call a movement. They're moments of a movement. From the side of the relative form, the Lenin expresses its value being as something totally different than itself, and thus shows itself to be a concealed social relation. But then we flip it to the other side and look at it, well, what's going on if we start from the side of the equivalent form? And then Marx says the equivalent form consists precisely in this, that the material commodity itself, the coat for instance, expresses value just as it is in its everyday life, and is therefore endowed with the form of value by nature itself. So as an equivalent form, the commodity that is the equivalent expresses value, albeit the value of the commodity it's measuring, in the form of itself, in the form of its own use value, in the form of its own material properties. And is therefore endowed with the form of value, the value form, by nature itself. Admittedly, this holds good only within the value relation, in which the commodity Lenin is related to the commodity quote as its equivalent. So, the value of something can only appear as something that something has by nature itself, when it stands in this value form relation. Like, there's a way in which the value form itself transforms value, that is, value created by labor, into something that looks like a natural property of a thing, into use value, into its opposite. And the value of things starts to look like their use values, as opposed to the labor embedded within them. Right? And mainstream economics today rejects the labor theory of value. And as I understand it, most theories of economics, the mainstream bourgeois neoclassical economics, would just see value as whatever a consumer is willing to pay, right? And so there's a sense in which use value is seen to be the measure of value, and it could be, argued that right here Marx is saying why this reification occurs, why value the value produced by labor appears if it were just this use value of the commodity. That's a thought, at least. I'm not sure. I would have to think more about that to run further with that. However, the properties of a thing do not arise from its relations to other things. They are, on the contrary, merely activated by such relations. That's important. Activated. Let's look up that word. I'm going to grab a pencil real quick. I have a box of pencils somewhere. I just got into them this morning before going to teach. I'm going to look at the top of this paragraph. I already have it underlined. How about that? So, betätigen. I recognize that word, but I'm not sure I could define it precisely, so let me pull up a dictionary. So to operate, to manipulate, to activate, to exert, to actuate. So activate is a good translation. It reminds me of like some of the words for like activity in German. So this is a things don't. It's interesting because like in a sense you want to say that things do have their properties insofar as they stand in relations to other things. Yet there's something about the thing that allows them to act in a specific way in such relations, right? So like the weight of the thing, right? Something can only have weight in relation to gravity and another thing that's weighing it, that's measuring it, right? But like the mass of the object grounds is some an intrinsic property that's activated by the Earth's gravity or the object it's measuring it, right? That's what he's saying here. The coat, therefore, seems to be... Oh, okay. So, and then he's going to say that that leads to this seems, scheint, not Erscheinung, but scheint, which I think I'm trying to argue is Marx's term for a type of ideology that is a false appearance. That's not the appearance of some underlying thing, but is a deceptive appearance. The coat, therefore, seems to be endowed with its equivalent form, its property of direct exchangeability, by nature just as much as its property of being heavy or its ability to keep us warm. Aha. So things seem to have, the coat seems like it has intrinsic value and can be exchanged for all of these things. Its equivalent form seems to be something that is natural to it, just like its property of being heavy or keeping us warm. But this is an illusion created by the value form itself. Hence the mysteriousness of the equivalent form, which only impinges on the crude bourgeois vision of the political economist when it confronts him in its fully developed shape, that of money. So, I think we already read a passage where Marx said that explaining money has eluded bourgeois economists. He's going to explain money, and he has this dialectical argument that we've been working through for this session and the last session. Now, I haven't studied the bourgeois economists in detail. I'd love to do that at some time. I know there is like an Adam Smith fellowship thing that Marxists go to sometimes, and they're happy to have them. That I might check out at some point just to get the background and know what Marx is talking about here. But I don't recall, from what little I've looked at, there being this use of the equivalent form in classical political economy. Now, if somebody knows those texts better, of Ricardo or Smith, and can confirm that, please do so in the comments. But this idea of seeing this A equals B and B equals A as different moments and different sides, Marx is saying that like when the bourgeois economists actually start looking at this B, that is the equivalent form for the A, they don't start looking at it until they get to money. They don't recognize it or see it even as something mysterious at the level of just barter exchanges. But Marx is saying it's already there. The weirdness and mysteriousness of the equivalent is already there if I'm just exchanging one thing for another. He, the bourgeois economist, then seeks to explain away the mystical character of gold and silver by substituting for them less dazzling commodities, and with ever-renewed satisfaction reeling off a catalog of all the inferior commodities which have played the role of the equivalent at one time or another. He does not suspect that even the simplest expression of value, such as 20 yards of linen equal one coat, already presents the riddle of the equivalent form for us to solve. So Marx is saying is like the riddle, what people are trying to figure out, the mystery of money, the riddle of money. They try to say like, oh, well, money like now plays the role of the equivalent. It measures all the commodities, just like the weights did, but they used to use other things for it and all this stuff. But it's kind of weird. But Marx is saying every expression of value already contains the riddle of money. It's not unique to money, and what's mysterious about it, the mystery of money is already found in the mystery of a single equivalence of trading of one thing to another. That's what he's saying here. Like, yeah, if you're trading like fucking Pokemon cards, right? That's weird. I could go on a whole tangent about whether you could use a Marxist economic analysis to explain that, because it's kind of like an inflation of artificially introduced scarcity. But every trade in a certain way already has the weirdness of money going on within it. That's what Marx is saying. The same thing that the bourgeois economists see to be mysterious or weird about money is already present in every single exchange. Let me just say, just for we'll see directly why later when we get into especially the actual money chapter, because we're going to be going through this long dialectical analysis that we will certainly not complete within an hour today of this section. But this is the section to really focus on in Capital, because this is these first two chapters really, and this section especially of the first chapter. I mean, the fetishism chapter, section 2 is really good, but like these are the ones to read closely. But I just want to say, just to get this out of the way, is that from a Marxist perspective, the idea that money is just something made up that we all just like agreed, like, oh, this is worth something when it's all bullshit. That's not a Marxist analysis of money whatsoever. Money has an objective basis for its value. It's more complicated now, and I'm sure there's Marxist economists who could give you a better explanation of it than I can, of what grounds money now. I know Radhika Desai has written a lot about this. Some other people too. I'm sure. I don't know all the literature on it, but from a Marxist standpoint, money is something objective, although it's still weird, and it arises from the value form. And what's weird about money and how it's objectively going to function, it's going to be a more concretized version of what we're seeing already abstractly in the equivalent form itself. Marx is going to say that it's the universal equivalent, as we'll see. So, if anybody says like, oh, money's just made up, money's not real, I mean, like, all right, fine. If it's so made up and it's not real, give it to me. Right? I'll take your money. I'll take your money if you don't think it's real. Just hand it over, Okay. Excuse me. I had the foresight to actually get the glass of water beforehand. All right, let me look ahead at where we're at. All right, this is going to be dialectics hour and maybe a half. We'll get it to this simple form. The body of the commodity. Der Körper der Ware. Which serves as the equivalent, always figures as the embodiment of abstract human labor, and is always the product of some specific, useful, concrete labor. So we're talking about the physical body of the commodity, which is its material properties, including its use values. We're talking about it in the form of the equivalent. So it's the thing that's being the measure of a value of something. Always figures as the embodiment of abstract human labor. So, right, this is the abstract and concrete human labor, dual nature of the commodities. Human labor in the abstract, that it is a product of some human labor and thus has value, and is always the product of some specific, useful, concrete labor, right? Because abstraction is something that takes place by virtue of the value form, whereas in reality, everything is specific, concrete labor. Like somebody really did something, but it contains human labor of some kind, right? Remember, like, all of us need like a job to make some money, and that money is like the equivalent of some amount, as we'll see, not all, of our human labor in the abstract. But what that job is would be like the specific useful thing. Hire somebody to make something, right? Specific useful things, but also hiring people to make value for you can be done in all different kinds of ways, and it doesn't really matter as far as value is concerned what people are doing in the abstract, as long as it is also simultaneously some specific useful concrete labor. But insofar as it creates value, it just is labor in the abstract. Okay, so now this concrete labor, the concrete labor that produces the equivalent commodity, therefore becomes the expression of abstract human labor. Okay, so we have the abstract human labor in commodity A, the relative form, and that's being expressed in the concrete labor, the real specific useful labor of commodity B, the equivalent form. If the code is merely abstract human labor's realization, realization I'm guessing is Verwirklichung, or Verwirklichung, I was right the first time. I'm getting tired there, I guess. Okay. The tailoring actually realized in it is merely abstract human labor's form of realization. So the tailoring actually realized then it would be the concrete labor, and this is just the form of realization, which is again one of these compound words, Verwirklichungsform, so actualization form. Verwirklich and is like actual as well, and Verwirklichung in philosophy, actualitate kind of thing. It could be equivalent to that. Or to realize, to actualize is another way of putting it. Because with realize you get into the whole like rational is real, when Hegel says the rational is actual, like it's something that's been a reality of a concept that's been brought into being, not just whatever happens to be real. Okay, so if the code is the merely abstract human labor's realization, the tailoring actually realized then it is merely abstract human labor's form of realization. Okay, in the expression of value of the Lenin, the usefulness of tailoring consists not in making clothes, and thus also people, but in making a physical object which we at once recognize as value, as a congealed quantity of labor, therefore which is absolutely indistinguishable from the labor objectified in the value of the Lenin. Okay, let's break this down. In the expression of value of the Lenin. Is this expression of value a compound word here again too? Yeah, Wertausdruck. Marx is like, doing that German thing. So you could say in the value expression. That's how I would translate it, I think. And the value expression of the Lenin. Just because I think it's punchier that way. Like saying value form instead of form of value, right? The value expression of the Lenin. I kind of want to go back and track that term, value expression, to see exactly what he's talking about here. It seems to be another term for the value form, but maybe from the side of the equivalent. Okay, in the value expression of the Lenin, the usefulness of tailoring consists not in making clothes, and thus also people, but in making a physical object which we at once recognize as value. Okay, so I think value expression means like when you're looking at the Lenin as an expression of value, not as a use value. So in terms of the value expression of the Lenin, tailoring is not just useful. Tailoring is not useful for making clothes. Tailoring is useful for creating value, right? That's the move. And we'll see how this gets topsy-turvy when we get to like the more detailed analyses of capitalism. I'm thinking here of like the valorization process and stuff. We haven't even got to capital yet. We haven't even got to explaining what capitalism is or what the formula for capital is. We're still on the very low level of this. Okay, so that's just like getting this terminology, but basically, if we look at any human labor in terms of this value expression, then what the human labor does isn't produce a specific use value. It produces value of some kind. Things that can be bought and sold. In order to act as such a mirror of value, tailoring itself must reflect nothing apart from its own abstract quality of being human labor. We have the mirroring talk again here. Yeah, notice too that because it's just from the standpoint of value, the tailoring creates value, not clothes, but value. The weaving makes not Lenin, but value. And so from that standpoint, they're indistinguishable, and that's why they're abstract human labor. Human labor power is expended in the form of tailoring as well as in the form of weaving. So we have these two different forms. Both therefore possess the general property of being human labor, and they therefore have to be considered in certain cases, such as the production of value, solely from this point of view. Right? So that's the point of view of the what he called it over here, the value expression. There is nothing mysterious in this. So from that's he's building up to the fetishism chapter. Right? I'm making clothes, you're making linen. We're both working. We're both doing our 9 to 5. So it's both human labor. Right? Like, duh, right? There's nothing mysterious in this. But in the value expression of the commodity, the question is stood on its head. Now, one can't help but think of dialectics and Hegel when Marx talks about standing things on its head. So I want to mark that passage real quick. We got to look at this footnote too. I think stand on its head is not exactly what is said in the German here. Although there could be a so it's verdreht, which is not a word that I know, which has a couple different definitions. Twisted, preposterous, skewed, kinky, right? So when the value expression of the commodity, the question gets kinky, I guess. That's one way to put it. Perverse. So perverse is also a way of translating verkehrt. Verkehrt is I think what is perverse in Freud, or perversion, Verkehrung, something like that. Also Hegel's inverted world. What is it? Die verkehrte Welt. I wrote a paper on it. I should remember the name of in German. Verdreht is a synonym for verkehrt, which has that kind of sense in Feuerbach of things being upside down, things being turned on its head. Inversion. Marx's account of dialectics talks about the retina. That ideology is like a retina that flips things upside down. We'll see more of that in the commodity fetishism chapter as well, or section as well. Wait, is there not a footnote in there's a footnote in my German text, but there's not a footnote in this one. Interesting. I'm not sure if I'm. I guess I can try to translate it off the top of my head. This is like a. So diese Verkehrung, so this perversion, inversion, probably inversion is the best translation here. Wodurch das sinnlich Konkrete, whereby the sensible concrete, als Erscheinungsform des abstract allgemeinen, I'm gonna go flip. What's the verb? Okay, pertains only as the form of appearance of the abstract universal, nicht das abstract allgemeine, So not as the abstract universal umgekehrt als Eigenschaft des Konkreten, but I guess like not on the other hand, but so only as the form of appearance of the abstract universal, not as the abstract universal on the other hand of the properties of the concrete. Charakterisiert den Wertausdruck. That characterizes the value expression, or the expression of value. So, okay, so there's an inversion whereby the sensible concrete only appears or only manifests itself as the form of appearance of the abstract universal, but doesn't manifest itself, or the abstract universal does not manifest itself as a property of the concrete. I guess this would be the of concrete labor. So like, okay, yeah. So the sensible concrete, the coat, is the form of appearance of the abstract universal. But the abstract universal is not seen in terms of, I think of the being a property of the concrete. Sie macht zugleich sein Verständnis schwierig. So I think it's just like it likewise makes its Verständnis. I think it's just like understanding here. Comprehension. So that makes its comprehension difficult. Sage ich. So I say Römisches Recht und Deutsches Recht. So Roman law and German law sind beide Rechte, are both laws. So ist das selbstverständlich. That's self-evident. Sage ich denn dagegen, das Recht, dieser abstrakte Begriff, verwirklicht sich im romanischen Recht und im deutschen Recht. Diesen konkreten Rechten, so wird der Zusammenhang wichtig. So if I say on the other, okay, so saying on the one hand, Roman law and German law are both laws. Yay, makes sense. Just like, hey, I work my job, you work your job, we both work, right? We both make value. Cool. But on the other hand, if I say that right, law, actualizes itself in Roman law and German law, the abstract law actualizes itself in the form of German law and Roman law, these concrete laws, then this connection becomes mystical. And that would be a kind of Hegelian idealist, in the way that Hegel looks at history, way of seeing things as like the idea of law manifesting itself in the particular forms of Roman and German law. So that's this footnote, and I'm not seeing it here, unfortunately. I'm not sure why that is. It might be from a manuscript difference. Okay, we still have a while to go. Let's see if we can get this. Okay, in order to express the fact that, for instance, weaving creates the value of linen through its general property of being human labor, rather than in its concrete form as weaving, we contrast it with the concrete labor which produces the equivalent of that linen, namely tailoring. Tailoring is now seen as the tangible form of realization of abstract human labor. So that would be the kind of like view of this abstract human labor being realizing itself through tailoring. The equivalent form therefore possesses a second peculiarity. In it, concrete labor becomes the form of manifestation of its opposite, abstract human labor. Right? So just as in the equivalent form, value appears in the form of its opposite, use value. Abstract human labor appears in the form of its opposite, concrete labor. And remember that those are like that's like the labor pole of the value use value distinction is value corresponds to abstract human labor, and use value is kind of like the in the same kind of position as the concrete specific labor. But because this concrete labor tailoring counts exclusively as the expression of undifferentiated human labor, it possesses the characteristic of being identical with other kinds of labor, such as the labor embodied in the linen. Consequently, although like all other commodities producing labor, it is the labor of private individuals, it is nevertheless labor in its directly social form. It is precisely for this reason that it presents itself to us in the shape of a product which is directly exchangeable for other commodities. Thus, the equivalent form has a third peculiarity. Private labor takes the form of its opposite, namely labor in its directly social form. Okay. So the third peculiarity is that what I do in private, that labor, because it creates things that are socially understood to be value, my private activity appears as a social activity. What I'm doing in private, making things, is part of a social process because what I make has value that can be traded for the use values I want. The two peculiarities of the equivalent form we have just developed, two? One of the three? I think I remember noting that in my English text, which I don't have in front of me. I just have the PDF here and German. We've just developed will become still clear if we go back to the great investigator who was the first to analyze the value form, like so many other forms of thought, society, and nature. I mean Aristotle, huh? So Aristotle was the first to come up with to analyze the value form. How did he do that if the value form is unique to capitalism? Huh? Value form theorists? That's very weird, isn't it? Aristotle must have been who's got on his time machine and went to the 19th century and figured this stuff out, huh? Or maybe the value form has existed for a lot longer than capitalism. Oh my god, I have to read ancient Greek now. In the first place, he states quite clearly that the money form of the commodity is only a more developed aspect of the simple form of value, i.e., of the expression of the value of the commodity and some other commodities chosen at random. For he says, 5 beds equal 1 house. I'm going to guess that that's what that says in Greek. I'm not very good at Greek. Is indistinguishable from 5 beds equals a certain amount of money. I did go through this in Greek at one point. I need a dictionary and yeah. He further sees that the value relation, which provides the framework for this expression of value expression itself, requires that the house should be qualitatively equated with the bed, and that these things, being distinct to the senses, could not be compared with each other as commensurable magnitudes if they lacked this essential identity. There can be no exchange, he says, without equality, and no equality without commensurability. Here, however, he falters and abandons the further analysis of the form of value. It is, however, in reality impossible that such unlike things can be commensurable, i.e. qualitatively equal. This form of equation can only be something foreign to the true nature of things. It is therefore only a makeshift for practical purposes. Now, I've checked this. This is from the Nicomachean Ethics, and I've just got to say, Marx's gloss on these passages make no fucking sense. I want to go to a Greek expert on this actually, because I'm very, very. I mean, he's a classicist, so he should know these things. But yeah, this gloss didn't make a lot of sense to me. I wasn't sure about it. I wanted to consult an expert on it. Last time I was working through this, haven't done that yet. Plan to at some point. I know there's an Aristotle scholar, my department, who's very becoming very interested in Marxism. So we'll have to have a conversation about it at some point. But yeah, go read the Nicomachean Ethics. Is a very interesting discussion about what makes exchanges fair, and you can see that Aristotle's starting to get at a hint of what Marx is looking at. Aristotle, therefore, himself tells us what prevented any further analysis: the lack of a concept of value. What is the homogeneous element, that is, the common substance, which the house represents from the point of view of the bed, in the value expression for the bed? Such a thing, in truth, cannot exist, says Aristotle. But why not? Towards the bed, the house represents something equal, insofar as it represents what is really equal, both in the bed and in the house, and that is human labor. However, Aristotle himself was unable to extract this fact that, in the form of the commodity values, all labor is expressed as equal human labor, and therefore is labor of equal quality, by inspection from the value form, because Greek society was founded on the labor of slaves, hence had as its natural basis the inequality of men in their labor powers. The secret of the value expression, namely the equality and equivalence of all kinds of labor, because insofar as they are human labor in general, could not be deciphered until the concept of human equality had already acquired the permanence of a fixed popular opinion. This, however, becomes possible only in a society where the commodity form is the universal form of the product of labor. Hence, the dominant social relation is the relation between men as possessors of commodities. Aristotle's genius is displayed precisely by his discovery of a relation of equality in the value expression of commodities. Only historical limitation inherent in the society in which he lived prevented him from finding out what in reality this relation of equality consisted of. So he seems to be saying that Aristotle knew that we were trading labor with each other, we're trading things with each other, but he wasn't able to notice that it's abstract human labor. That's the source of value. That's what Marx is claiming actually is one of his biggest original contributions to classical political economy, that what forms the substance of value is not just labor time, but that it's human labor, it's socially necessary labor, but also human labor in the abstract, without regard that it's been there's a concrete universality or a real abstraction that occurs where labor has been stripped of its individual parts. Let me go look at my copy of the Nicomachean Ethics real quick, just to see what my notes were, if there's anything interesting. So I'm going to pause for a second. Book 5, Chapter 5. Yeah, so this is Aristotle's discussion of justice in exchange. Um, so I think actually if you wanted to talk about there being an ethics in capital, looking at it from the perspective of justice in exchange, right? Because we have all these theories of unequal exchange, uneven exchange, things like that, right? There is that kind of Aristotelian ethics of exchange in here. um, there's some problems, I think, with Marx's gloss on this, although I'd like to consult an expert on that. But there is this discussion of doing a service for someone and they have to do a service in return. Currency as guaranteeing future exchange. Um, but he does seem to see need as the measure pulling things together, and currency as what makes things equivalent to each other. But he talks about um, this thing of like proportionate return, but also that people who are different and unequal are equalized in exchanging with each other. So there's this critique of like auto affection where he says no community for exchange is formed from two doctors. It is formed from a doctor and a farmer, and in general from people who are different and unequal and must be equalized. Um, and so similarly, he talks about the products being equalized to each other. Um, and a proportionate equality between things. So I think this is it's a very short read. It's like 3 pages of Aristotle. In the Hackett, there's also I just as a instructor I get books for free, so I ordered the Joe Sachs translation. Joe Sachs often tries to like get the kind of Greek experience of reading Aristotle here. But yeah, there's this. I wonder if I'll look at the Sachs and see if there's something kind of more similar to that fits Marx's gloss better. But there's this whole analysis of like justice and exchange that's kind of being pulled from here in Capital, which is really interesting. It's not something